Hello, everyone. My name is Bob Morrison. I'm the Director of Arts at New Jersey, and pleased to be here with you today for this conversation on the latest guidance for performing arts as we come into the fall of 2021. Joining me today are Dr. James Weaver from the National Federation of State High School Associations and his colleague, Mark Spede, who is the president of the College Band Directors National Association. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Welcome.
Thanks, Bob.
So first, can you talk a little bit about the importance of following, state and local health recommendations in this environment, particularly given the fact that they vary so widely from state to state at this point?
All right. Yeah. Every state and local municipality will have a different set of guidelines that they're going to have to adhere to. One thing we've done in the United States is we have moved the mitigation capacity as far down to the local level as humanly possible. And so we end up having local school districts to local towns, to counties, to clusters of counties, to states that all have their different recommendations and guidances. Depending on what state you're in will depend on the level that you're going to have. So some are the statewide requirements, mandates, those kind of things. Some regulated down to the county level, and some just regulated down even farther than that. So it's really important to follow those and be aware of what they are. And our discussion, I think, today will give you some tools and some conversation starters to have with key stakeholders and leaders in those areas to say if things are getting very restricted and you want to be like, let's have a conversation how we continue to have performing arts activities. I think our goal here today is to try to give you those tools to have those conversations so they can be incorporated into those local and state level recommendations.
I think it's also important to impress upon everyone that you're speaking with that the recommendations that we have put out from the International Coalition Performing Arts Aerosol study are truly science-based. They do mitigate transmission of coronavirus, and those seeking to circumvent those mitigations by just canceling music are not really making sound decisions based on science. So we have the data, and ours is not the only study. There are a number of studies out there who have found very similar results, and we feel confident that using this layered approach to mitigations will reduce the risk to an acceptable level for everyone.
Well, let's talk about the mitigations, and particularly why there's, what are the mitigation strategies and how important they are in this environment where we have such a large portion of our student population that remain unvaccinated.
Yeah, so we have 5 key elements to the recommendations. Those of you who have been following the study know these pretty well. We're talking about masking, distancing, timing, hygiene, and air quality. Those are our really big 5 pillars to what we do for mitigations. And what we found, we did an analysis of over 3,000 schools last spring, I think it was, Mark. So we ran the survey in April, came out with April and May, came out with the results in June. We had 3,000 schools respond, and of those 3,000 schools, we had 1,641 self-identified COVID cases within a music program. We did it in music just because it was an easier group to attach to because they meet every day. And of those 1,641 schools that had a COVID positive student in their program, only 8 of them identified as a spread inside of their program. Of those 8, only 1 was more than a 1-to-1 transmission component. So that gives us some pretty good confidence that we know that masking both the student, the instrument, having some distance, having reduced time, increasing the airflow, and then making sure we're following hygiene recommendations is really quite effective. And so I think that's a really good area we were able to say, yeah, we had some real world experience. And to give an idea of how many students this was, we're estimating this is based off of nationwide. If we see the same kind of percentages, we're talking millions of students and hundreds of millions of hours of rehearsal time. And so we know that we have some good data as far as what the mitigation risk level was.
And I'd like to add to that, in the risk assessment piece that we did, those 7 programs that self-identified one-to-one transmission, there wasn't professional contact tracing done. We included them and assumed that it happened in the music classroom, but we don't know that. It could have easily happened in the cafeteria, after school, wherever the students might have been together unmasked. So even with all that said, the risk of transmitting COVID in a classroom this past year during 2020 was only 1 in 2 million for a 30-minute rehearsal period. That's extremely low, and that is a very conservative number. The actual number is probably higher than that, less of a chance. But even 1 in 2 million, that seems to be pretty low to me.
Yeah, and one thing that I think Mark and I both, I'll speak for Mark on this one, Mark and I both found interesting is if you didn't use the mitigations, your risk level went up by 4.57 times the amount compared to if you used the mitigations.
So, I mean, the point here is that the mitigations work. The mitigations were extremely effective in significantly reducing risk to levels similar to a regular classroom where students are sitting with masks. And by following mitigation strategies, we are able to bring our programs in and have our students engage in these performing arts activities within their schools, which I think I think we all agree is critically important as our students are now coming back to school in many places, being out of school for 18 months or so. So can you, related to this, can you touch on is there any difference between how effective the strategies are versus the first variation of the virus versus the Delta variation of the virus that everyone's concerned about now?
Yeah, so when we did the study to begin with, we focused on the vehicle in which the virus transmits in. That was done kind of intentionally on our end, and then also kind of by design, because we can't infect people on purpose with a deadly virus. That's a little on the unethical side. And then we also were constrained with what we could actually measure from a like an NIH level lab sort of an idea, right? Because that's not really where we're going with this. So we really focused in on what size of particles can be carrying the COVID-19 virus. As Mark said earlier, the COVID-19 virus is the same size. And so I like to equate this as a highway, right? So if you have a 6-lane highway and it is just packed with cars and everyone's going 10 miles an hour, and then you start using all these mitigations where now we're taking about 90% of the vehicles that can carry the virus out of the environment, which is what the mask, the bell covers, the distance, the air purifiers, those kind of things do, is they take out about 90% of the vehicles that are there. Now we have a very easy moving area with not a lot of cars on there. And so we have focused on reducing the amount of ways that we can depopulate that highway, and then thus reduces the amount of viral load that's out in the air, and then we can reduce the infection risk. So I know, Mark, you've got some more things you want to say on that.
Yeah, and I think, obviously we're all concerned about how the virus is mutating, but one thing that's not happening is the virus is not getting smaller. So all these mitigation strategies that we're using, especially the masking and the bell covers, are capturing over 90% of the aerosol that's coming out of the mouth, instrument, etc. So that part of our strategy has not changed. If the virus were somehow getting smaller and smaller, then we would have a different concern. But really, it's as small as it's going to get. It's very small anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that on the APS data that we had when we collected everything, we were able to narrow in really specifically on the viral particle size and the aerosolization particle size. So like we didn't do some of the measurements that tracked like every amount of particle that would ever come out of the human body, because some of them are extremely small and couldn't carry the virus anyway. So we really honed down on this is the range of the size they can transmit in, and that's really what we're focused on. I think the other thing people will probably wonder too is if they go to our effectiveness chart, like where it says like here's how effective the bell covers are and whatnot, and you'll see, for example, like saxophone says 68%, and Mark and I keep saying we stop about 90% of all the particles. The reason why you'll see a discrepancy in that description is because there's very little coming out of the saxophone to begin with. So we're bringing it down to background. So when we say we're cutting out about 90% of the aerosols coming into the environment, we're basically saying that we're bringing it down to the background level of aerosol in the room, and thus we're reducing the overall risk by about 90%.
Excellent. So let's talk about specific strategies in different performing arts areas. So let's talk about speech and debate. What are some of the thoughts around how this plays out in a speech and debate process?
Sure. So when we talk about speech and debate, there's a couple of things that happen at a competition level, right? So we really do believe that we should be getting back into in-person competition whenever possible, because it is a good way. It's just a natural skill that all students need to have. And Mark will talk about that in music, because I'm not always going to talk first, by the way. So we get to music, Mark will be leaning on that one first. But in speech, debate, and theater, when we start talking about how to do competition, for example, let's take a speech round, for example. You're gonna have about 7 speakers coming in. You're gonna have limited audience. You're gonna have a judging panel. In our opinion, the judging panel and the spectators should be masked the whole time and watching the things. So should all the performers. Now, when you come up to actually give your 7-minute, 10-minute, whatever state rule you have on how long your speech is, you should walk up to your speaking area, remove mask, speak, replace mask, walk off to the side, and enjoy the next competitor round that you will be watching. That's really a good common practice. And the main reason why is because you have a fair amount of distance between you and the next people around you. And that distance really does matter. And so if you're a good 6, 7, 8 feet apart, you can go ahead and make that demasking, give your speech or your interpretation, remask up and go. When we start talking about debate where we have multiple people on a stage, the same theory applies, right? You're going to be spread out. You're going to have your tables on both sides of the podium. As the speaker is going to come up, you will come up, demask, do your speech or your cross round or whatever you're going to be doing, remask, and then move back over to your preparation area. When you have a cross-examination component, say in debate, it's best to have that apart from each other, but then make sure that your mask is clear, because some people speak at a very rapid pace in debate. And so you want to be able to make sure that's clear and concise. Judging panels, spectators, again, I think we should continue the recommendation to be masked in those environments, as long as the CDC recommendation to be masked in those environments remains in place.
And how does this then apply to theater?
So same kind of thing, but theater is a little bit more complex because there's a lot of moving parts in theater. So there's a couple of things we need to really look at when we look at theater is what space are we using? How many participants are you having in your cast? And then are you going to be doing things indoors or outdoors? So for example, in the space you're going to use, are you going to use a theater classroom component? Are you going to use a black box theater? Are you going to use a large stage proscenium theater? All of those things have different environmental regulations that occur within them to see how much you need to have as far as air exchange rates. Because if you're going to use a classroom size theater, it's an air exchange rate of a minimum of 3 per hour, and then you crank it up from there. But if you're in a 12 to 2,000 seat auditorium that has like a couple million square cubic volumes of space, then you're talking about a CFM measurement, which is a different kind of measurement you have to look at. Also, when you look at how you're going to do participants, so we should look at my participants able to be cohorted. So when you design a show that can say these 4 kids are always on stage at a time, and then these 4 are on a stage at a time, and never shall they combine, then you can cohort them and track whatever's going to happen on the stage. Are we going to be using masks off for leads? Can we design our stage blocking in a way to kind of keep people separated around? So if we demask for certain parts of the theater presentation, we're far enough away from people with good airflow that allows us to be safe in those environments. How we're going to do rehearsal in the stagecraft area. So those are all things we just need to really think through and think about. You should and can have theater competition, have theater performances. Those should not go away. It's just going to take a little bit more planning in what show am I going to have? How am I going to design my stage blocking? And what can I do to keep my kids far enough away, but yet close enough together to have a solid performance? And we all know our theater directors are very creative in designing those shows, and we'll figure all that stuff out. But really look at where we're going to be and how many students we're going to have. And maybe when we have a big chorus line, probably good to have them masked up at the moment. Mark, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, sorry. I was going to say, the whole idea behind all of these mitigations is to reduce risk, right? So we're not saying that any environment is safe. There's no such thing as a safe environment. Even before COVID hit, people were carrying pathogens all the time. We know our students were getting sick. They passed colds to each other. They passed the flu. They passed, lots of other pathogens one to another.
PAC plague that always happened at musical theater time, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're just trying to reduce that risk as much as we possibly can, and feel that these mitigations do significantly reduce risk.
And certainly as it comes to theater and actually any of these activities, outdoors is going to be preferable to, or be more advantageous in certain areas, particularly as it relates to ventilation, as opposed to indoors. So there, that may be a consideration in areas where that's an option. That outdoors is a viable option that you can do to provide these activities. Let's turn to music. Let's start with elementary music. And what are some considerations for elementary music educators, particularly as it relates to singing and recorder?
Go ahead, James. You
Okay.
got it.
So, sorry, I feel bad. Your time's coming up here. All right. So when we start talking about elementary, there's a lot of things that we have to remember about little kids and how they move into an environment, right? So a couple things we want to look at for school policies. If you're doing aerosolization activities in your elementary general music classroom, they should be following the same recommendations that your school has for when they're in their general classroom. So if they're in the general classroom and you have a masking recommended or a masking required, they should be doing the same thing in your general education room for your general music. And that goes like if you're just doing non-singing dancing, like you're going to hit play on the deal and you're going to dance around the room and no one's singing to that, then whatever you're doing in your math class, you should be doing in this classroom. If you're doing boom whackers, you're doing ORF instruments, you're doing any of those things, those should all be the same from their general ed classroom to your classroom. Now, if you're going to do high aerosolization activities, such as recorder and singing, recorder is pretty easy. You just got to put a cloth something on the bottom to catch the large aerosol droplets and you're done. That's it. Doesn't have to be fancy, doesn't have to be anything, because there's no wet vibrating surface on the recorder. And so you're not aerosolizing those larger particles. You're just trying to catch the stuff that's still a large particle droplet before it spews out in the environment for whatever distance. When it comes to singing, I would recommend having some sort of a singing mask. And I use that as a general term, not as a specific brand name term, just to be clear about that. And the easiest thing to do, honestly, is just to go buy the blue paper masks that are F2100 standard for ASTM, and have your administration buy you boxes upon boxes of those. So when we're ready to go sing, you train your kids like, okay, let's go grab a mask. And they grab their mask, they put it on, they sing. When they're done, they throw it in the garbage can and they went out the door, and life is good. Those are highly effective masks. They are, the reason why they're so effective is there's still 3 layers. That middle layer is a blown in non-woven material that acts as like a static balloon to aerosol particles. And so when you start talking about that in the elementary class, that's really what you want to have when you start those singing components.
I'd just like to add, since we're talking about the blue surgical mask style, we've all seen surgeries done by surgeons and staff. They're all wearing those masks. They are not wearing those masks to protect themselves, really. They're wearing those masks to protect the patient who now has an open incision from infection. So the same concept applies. The mask isn't to protect an individual, it's to protect the others around the person who may be infected. So that mask will catch much of the aerosol that could be carrying virus from getting out into the environment. That's the whole purpose of masking. And I think it's somehow we've lost that concept along the way, that somehow masks are the most protective for myself from catching it from someone else. It does have an effect, yes, but the major component of that is keeping infected aerosol from getting out into the environment by blocking it at the point where the aerosol is produced.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I want to reinforce the issue around the recorder that, based on the research, the recorder itself is not generating aerosols, but whatever, the bell cover that is used, the cloth around the bell, is there to be able to catch any of the condensation, any of the droplets that come, from playing the instrument, but it's not that it's creating any aerosols whatsoever.
Right. Yeah, no wet vibrating surface on the recorder.
Yeah, and so then, we should point out that similar to the flute, the recorder, they're blowing air through an open throat, not passing through the vocal cord, etc. There's going to be a very small amount of aerosol produced. Just a very small amount by just breathing. So we're trying to catch anything that might be coming out through the breath as well.
Got it. So then let's talk about instrumental music now, so and vocal music at the high school level. What do we do in those performance settings, both rehearsal and performance, to again reduce the risk for our programs to continue in a robust way?
Yeah, I think certainly the singing aspect, we know that masks are going to be very effective, and I think at least until the CDC recommends that we don't need to wear masks anymore, that especially in choir settings, singing settings, that we think about wearing a mask, and for the very same reason I just stated, that we're trying to capture the pathogen at its source. If that person were infected, we keep it from getting into the room. As far as instruments, the bell covers really serve the same purpose to capture aerosol as it leaves the end of the instrument. The two concepts are the same. Reduce the amount of aerosol getting into the room, masking and bell cover.
And then, Mark, related to that, we've seen recently where a lot of the recommendations allow for the instrumentalists to not have a instrumentalist mask when they're playing the instrument, but I actually see them using a different strategy. Could you address that for our educators?
Sure, and this really goes to your individual comfort level and also the rate of transmission in your community. So if your community is experiencing a high rate of positivity in terms of COVID, you might consider using the slitted mask concept so that the player is still wearing a mask. They put their mouthpiece through the flap or whatever, and then minimize the amount of aerosol. I think if the community transmission rate is fairly low, you can consider not wearing a mask while the instrumentalist is playing. Still use the bell cover, but just instruct your players not to speak without a mask on. So in other words, you wear a mask up until the point you're going to play. You can take the mask off, you play, and then put the mask back on. And certainly, if we stop and somebody wants to ask a question, you tell them, please put your mask on first. So speaking is a high aerosol producing activity, just like singing. So we want to minimize the amount of speaking without a mask on. James, anything to add?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why we also looked at that and why if you have high levels of transmission, you may want to look at the performance mask again. But one of the main reasons why is most of the aerosol that's coming through the instrument is going through the instrument. It's the law of fluid dynamics, right? And so it's going to follow the path of least resistance. And that path is, as you blow basically a stream of air into the instrument, it's going to keep following that stream of air out the instrument. So when we looked at, as we got more and more refined data, we're not seeing a lot of aerosol coming out of the instrument through like keyholes or the embouchure. We're seeing a vast majority going through that bell. And so the bell cover really is highly effective in catching most of it. And the performance mask is just catching the stuff that's coming from around the embouchure. And I think that is another reason why we kind of made it more of an optional type thing. But if, like Mark said, if it's a high transmission area in your county or your city, then you can really look at that because you're probably transmitting a whole bunch everywhere you're going.
And with the recent update to the report that came out in July, there was also a change in both a decrease in the distancing recommendation and an increase in the amount of time for these activities, particularly for singing, for performances or instrumental music making. Can you talk briefly about what influenced those decisions?
James, you want to take a crack first?
Sure. So what we looked at when we started looking at all of the data coming in and how the modeling works, we really started seeing kind of how that aerosol cloud accumulates over time. And so one thing we're seeing is that our initial recommendation of 30 minutes is because we were being very cautious and saying, okay, let's make sure that we can stop that cloud from getting near anybody, right? And then the 6 foot distancing was really pinned upon us by the CDC because that's what their recommendation continued to have. They have since aligned kind of where our thinking is in that 3 foot recommendation. And so with the 3 foot recommendation from the CDC, we're following suit on that distance. And then as we looked at how much that accumulating cloud would grow over time, we felt pretty confident that at an hour, it really gets big, but at 50 minutes, we're still below that threshold for the 3-foot distancing. And so we really thought that we were confident in saying, all right, 15 minutes, 3 feet, we should be good. If you add more distance, there may be an example for more time, but we don't have the data on that yet. So I'm not so super comfortable kind of diving into that kind of a calculation.
And also, if you know that your room has a high air exchange rate, for instance, industry standard is 3 changes per hour. If you know your room has, say, 6 changes per hour or 10 changes per hour, you could also consider increasing the time of the rehearsal. But you really need to know what that air change rate is. So we're basing our recommendation on standard 3 changes per hour.
So what if I don't know my air changes? What if my administration doesn't know? What do you recommend as strategies? Or what if my room has a low air change rate? What can I do as a music educator, or what can I take to my administration as a suggestion to address this?
So if you don't know what it is, I would just start assuming that it's 0, right? Like, we have no air change in here at all. Now, that's going to not be true, right? You're going to have some air change rate unless you're in like a box with no vents or anything. But if you assume it's at 0 and then go to your administration and say, hey, we need HEPA air cleaners to get us up to 3, right? And since we don't know and we can't find out, let's assume it's 0 and let's crank that bad boy up to 3. And so there's all sorts of HEPA air cleaner products that are out there. Make sure that they're CADRE certified. You don't want to just go buy one that's like, we're the best air cleaner in the world and check us out. If they don't have the CADR rating to them, then they don't really, there's no industry proof that that's what they really do. And we've got information about that on the study website. But then what's nice about it is if you do go that approach, but assume it's 0, get up to 3 through HEPA air cleaners, then if you do have 1 or 2 or 3 air change rates per hour that you can't prove it's actually there, you're getting that much more clean air coming in your room.
Right, and still the strategies of opening windows, opening doors to create cross ventilation will help the air change rate as well. So those things should still be considered if you don't know your air change rate, or even if you do, you can still increase the ventilation that way.
And I think the other thing too that Mark mentioned is really important is the cross ventilation, right? So if you just have one room where you just open it up into stagnant air with a window, that's not actually creating that cross ventilation. So you want to make sure you're actually creating the fresh air coming into your room.
So I'm a music educator. I'm in my classroom. I don't have, because of scheduling, I don't have the luxury of time for that air change. My kids are coming in, and I'm, I do one class, and then another class comes in. Are there things that I can do that will still allow me to have activity in my room with singing and playing, even though I don't have that luxury of a pure air change?
Yeah, I think teachers can sort of get creative about some activities that don't involve aerosol production. So just sitting quietly and breathing with a mask on is going to create very minimal aerosols. So after your music portion or your theater portion where you're speaking, singing, playing, you can have an activity where the students are just sitting, doing another activity that doesn't involve singing, playing, speaking. So, you can think of all sorts of ways to get around that and still have a productive learning environment. So having the students sit quietly doing another activity, for 15-20 minutes is the same or almost the same as leaving the room.
Or the other way they could do it is they could buffer it, right? So the first part of the class is that activity, then they're in the playing or singing aspect of it, and then they have another buffer. They can add those together as they're layering classes in, and almost come up with that that air change window. In light of that type of schedule. I think that's very helpful for folks. And then the last thing, just to reinforce it, there was an article today that I just couldn't miss. What about shields and partitions?
Don't use them.
Yeah. They're only effective in very brief, short-range environments with no masks on. the cashier at your grocery store, somebody behind an office desk where the public comes in. But creating boxes inside of a room with partitions, very ineffective. Creating dead zones for the HVAC system, and shields, certainly wearing on your face with no mask, really are not doing anything about aerosol, and that's really where the virus is catching a ride to other people. So they don't protect you. They have minimal protection on somebody around you, except if you're face to face, perhaps a very brief protective effect, but only a few
only
seconds.
Large droplets too.
Right.
Yeah.
That aerosol is still gonna go around the shield and into the room. So shields and partitions not recommended.
Excellent. Well, any thoughts about next steps as we're moving into the fall? Next steps with the study, other things that we should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, I think a couple things to look out for is right now, while the weather in our continent is still pretty good, great time to go outdoors, re-engage the students in the community of speech, debate, theater, music, get them back into the activity that they love and can be part of the community. Really important to do. It's easy to do outdoors because the earth is huge. There's lots of fresh air on the planet. And so it dilutes very quickly. As winter starts creeping from north to south, I think it's really important that you know what you are able to do before you go inside the classroom, right? So if you were one of those districts that never met in person last year, have those conversations yesterday with your administrators on, do I have ESSER funds to buy air cleaners? Do I have ESSER funds to make sure I'm not sharing instruments? Do I have ESSER funds to make sure that I have the proper PPE inside my classroom, whether it's bell covers or masks? I see Bob nodding on the ESSER funds. ESSER funds can be used for a lot of things. And there is a ton of resources on how to get to those dollars, right? Bob's got some on his ArtsEd New Jersey page and Sphere Readiness. The NFHS has some on our Return to Music programs. I know Mark has some through the CBDNA resources. Almost everybody has something out there that talks about ESSER funds. Make sure we have those conversations with our administrators. That's the next big step. The next step for us in the study is we extended the study to go through December. So we are refining to make sure we know how much of everything we have going out there exists. That's really important, I think, for us to really nail down. Mark, I don't know if you remember this. I was thinking about this the other day. This was supposed to be a 6-month study.
Right.
We started in May of 2020, and we were supposed to be done by November. So I'm very fortunate that we've been able
Just didn't say November of what year, right?
Yeah.
Correct.
Exactly.
So I feel very fortunate for the performing arts community that we really came together in an unprecedented way that allowed us to have the resources to continue the study into this December. So we really know some things that we may not have known otherwise.
And one more point about outdoors that James was talking about. One other factor that's helping us is the coronavirus is vulnerable to UV light. So if you're in the sunshine, well, even on a cloudy day, that UV light is still out there. That's another protective layer when you're outdoors. And finally, I would just add to everything that James said about our study and everything else. If you are living in a community where administrators are still talking about not allowing music activity, we need to make this stop. It's not based on anything but fear and witchcraft. We need to follow the science and stop this this voodoo type of mentality that we're going, this is a high risk activity. It's not. If we use the mitigations, it's possibly lower than some other aspects of being in school. So we know how to do this. It's proven by science. It's been borne out in the assessment that we did, our risk study, a risk analysis. We need to advocate for our programs, and we need to do it now. So these pockets that I know are still out there, people are still struggling. We need to advocate. We need to link to the science. The paper is out. It's almost published. It's gone through the peer review process. It's good data. It's real science. And it works.
Well, and I would argue that we have more scientific-based strategies for performing arts than any other academic or scholastic activity. So, we've taken this very seriously to make sure that we know what are the protocols that we can put in place to reduce risks so that our programs can continue for the benefit of our students. And at the end of the day, that's what this is all about, providing these opportunities for all of our students. So I want to thank both Dr. Weaver and Mark Spede, the co-chairs of the International Performing Arts Coalition Aerosol study, who have given us this update. And this is information that we can use right now to make sure our students come back into schools. And regarding your ESSER funds, there's a deadline coming up before the end of the year. And remember, if you don't ask, you don't get. So ask for those funds to support your programs. Make sure you do everything you can to have your programs operational this fall. And again, thanks to Mark and James for your leadership on behalf of all of us for this research and allowing us to find ways for our programs to continue.